Welcome to Middleware Friday, episode 86, 1st of June 2018, Managing Azure Pricing. So in this episode I'd like to talk about pricing in Azure, so depending on what components you would use in your solution, how you could calculate those, and how you also could manage costs in certain perspective, whether it be through reporting or through third-party tools or through the Azure portal. So what would determine pricing? So for instance, you could look at functions, and then you look at compute and the amount of CPU cycles basically in the background you're using, and memory. Could be actions when you're looking at logic apps. Could be data transfer units when you look at using SQL Azure, or request units with regards to Cosmos, or data warehouse units. So there's certain units of measures which is attached to a certain price, and that's what you kind of have to pay. So what you see is kind of the pay-as-you-go prices for what you use, similar to if you use electricity, you pay for wattage, for instance. There's other ways you could have like prepaid hours in certain services. You could have an app service plan. In general, the costs are dependent on what kind of resources you're using with regards to CPU, memory, storage, if you look at VMs, for instance. And another cost factor would be if you want to include support with your services or not. So some of these, and there's probably some other examples, determines kind of the price of your Azure services. So how could you calculate the price? Well, Microsoft provides an Azure calculator, which is accessible through a browser. So you can go to pricing calculator and then just choose the services you want to use for your solution, and then you can start calculating what the price would be. So how would you manage costs? So in one day you can determine costs, but once you have your solution running in Azure, you could see directly in the portal what, for instance, the cost would be on the resource group, or what the provision service planning would be, what cost management is bidding. That's another way you could look at it. So there's certain, when you provision the service, you can look at the pricing. It usually has a tab, not always, which tells you what the pricing could be depending on what kind of SKU you use. There's in the portal itself, in the blade on the left hand side, you can see cost management and billing. So that's where you can look at it. You can use also for the Azure portal, you have access to what's called the Azure Cloud, which I'll demonstrate later on. There's APIs you could call, either the rate card API or the Azure REST billing API. You could use like a partner solution, which is Cloud Cruiser or Azure Costs, or you could have a tool like Cloud or Docket, which could give you a good overview what your costs could be. So, for instance, you could call the APIs through an Azure function. So there's an example which uses a function built in Node.js, which enables you to get the costs or download the costs. So I'll demonstrate it in a second. Then there's a third-party tool. As an MVP, I was able to get access to this tool. It's a partner tool which you have to pay for, but enables you to generate documentation, including you can generate documentation around billing. So you can have a good overview of your running costs in the cloud using Cloud or Docket. So let's just go to a demo and show a few things around Azure pricing. Okay, so the first, I already mentioned this, you could get access to cost management called Cloudin. So you have a trial version for a certain period, and then there's a free and there's a paid subscription. So this is the overview of the Azure Cloudin. You can see some of my costs. I could drill down. At least I can click on one of those. Here it is. So it kind of predicts what my costs are. Because I haven't got a paid subscription, so I don't get access to all the features, but it does give you access to look some of your cloud costs, also providing capabilities of an optimizer and such, depending on, and this has more to do with, in case you're running virtual machines and such, what the optimal cost would be depending on your workloads. Then I already mentioned this function. So this is the function built in Node.js. So you're able to deploy this through the GitHub, and you can run this by providing a filter in the request body, and when this runs, it will calculate the costs for you. It might take some time to calculate the cost and have this provisioned for you, or at least have this calculated for you. And here it is. So as I said, it will take a while to get access to the costs. And as you can see here on the right hand side, these are the costs belonging to the filter I gave in the filter. So I can say, okay, give me the costs for the research group Middleware Friday. So there's the download consumption costs function, and then there's also the get consumption cost node function. And I'll just do something similar. I'll just run it again. And this is something you could try it yourself. So you can easily deploy it. You have to provide the tenant ID, the client ID, the client secret. So you have to have a service principal in place. And once you give those details, then you can try this out yourself. Run it and then see what the behavior of these two services are. But they basically are talking to the card rate API. So these are kind of the overall costs of my resource group. Another way looking at this is downloading a sample which calls the usage API. So I've downloaded the code, and basically, as you can see here, it calls that API, and then you just have to provide a start and end date. So I just narrowed that down a bit, and then I can run this, and then I have to do the authentication. Signing in, so this is the authentication process, and I will call that user service. Then you can see the costs of my Azure subscription, and I can also have it in JSON. And then I'm done. And what it will give me is a file. Let me see if I got a file here. Basically, you could output this to a file. I haven't done this in this case, but you could, and then you could drill down, or at least look this up. So I've put it here in JSON editor, so this kind of gives you the look and feel of what's in that JSON output. So if you output it to a file, you could do something with this file depending on, you can build, for instance, your own report. As I said, this is the function. So if you want to do the function which you just demoed, you can get this through GitHub. And then there's Cloud.docket. So I've already done generate a document before I started this episode, because this takes a while to be generating. So if you have a paid subscription to this Cloud.docket, then you just have to, they'll just generate a service principal. So they'll generate this for you. At least they need to generate, they need a service principal to get access to your subscription. And once that's all set up, then you can generate a document. So I've done this just for the billing, and it will create quite an extensive document showing the services I'm using, and basically gives me good insight of my usage of my subscription. There's a lot of visualizations and drill downs it generates. So once you've generated the documentation, you will also get an email saying, okay, hey, it's available for you, or it's generated, and it will also give you a summary. This is quite a nice service to just provide you some insight in your costs. So just to give you some examples of how you can get a better overview of your costs, either using Cloud-in or third protocol called Docket, or maybe you can roll your own solution leveraging one of the APIs. Either you create an on-premise console application, for instance, or something else, leveraging those APIs, or you can even use a function for it, which I demonstrated as well. So with regards to the function, you do have to set up some service principal kind of capability. If you do not, then you might run into an error. So when you try this sample out, definitely set this up, because otherwise you run into this error. And basically, this error, even when you set it up, you have to set the reader role on top of your service principal. So that's another thing you need to do. So set up that service principal, and then also in PowerShell do log in into your subscription and just execute this new role assignment, and then you subsequently can verify that it needs to read a role. So I've put this down here as well. If you running into that type of situation, you can resolve that using the PowerShell calls you just see here. Okay, with regarding to pricing, there are some costs, or in general when you look at Azure. So one of the things would be, what kind of workloads are you going to put on your Azure? What type of complexity? So how you can compose your solution with type of services. Then of course the availability of the service in general, because it's platform as a service, the availability is part of Microsoft's offering. But in certain situations with internet or infrastructure as a service, you might have to look at availability for your applications if that's necessary. Then there's security, and there's also governance. Who can and that's an important aspect. Who can generate what type of services within your resource group? So basically, it's best to set up a resource group for you developers and just limit them in what they can and cannot provision, basically. So that's kind of what you have to think about. Your costs in general, you do have to have governance. You do have to look over, and I think some of these tools or having a solution in place can help you look into what your running costs are in Azure, because if you don't, then you're easily running a lot of costs, or you start using services that are not really being used. So they still run, but you're not really extensive making use of it. And then with regard to workloads, it depends on what's the best fit for your workload. So what type of service would suit best, also if you look at regards to costs. And then the other thing you could do, using or leveraging ARM templates when you want to scale up, let's say, or provision a test environment for a certain amount of time, and then just tear it down once it's not being used. So that's another way of limiting your costs as well, and think about in costs in general. So I'd like to thank you everyone for watching this episode, and thank Bistop360 for being a great host. And I'll leave you with the music credits.